Chapter 7 of Call of the Wild, our final chapter. Title of this chapter is The Sounding of the Call. When Buck earned $1,600 in 5 minutes for John Thornton, he made it possible for his master to pay off certain debts, journey with his partners into the East after a fabled lost mine, the history of which was as old as the history of the country. Many men had sought it, few had found it, and more than a few that were there had never returned from the quest. This lost mine was steeped in tragedy and shrouded in mystery. No one knew of the first man. The oldest tradition stopped before it got back to him. From the beginning there had been an ancient and ramshackle cabin. Dying men swore to it and the mine of the site which had marked since their testimony with nuggets that were unlike any known grade of gold in the Northland. But no living man had looted this treasure house, and the dead were dead. Wherefore John Thornton and Pete and Hans, with Buck and half a dozen other dogs, faced into the east on an unknown trail to achieve where men and dogs as good as themselves had failed. They slid 70 miles into the Yukon, swung to the left into Stewart Creek, past Mayo and McQuestion, and held on to Stewart, itself a streamlet, threading the upstanding peaks which marked the backbone of the continent. John Thornton asked little of man or nature. He was unafraid of the wild. With a handful of salt and a rifle, he could plunge into the wilderness and fare wherever he pleased as long as he pleased. Being in no haste, Indian fashion, he hunted his dinner in the course of the day's travel, and if he failed to find it, like the Indian, he kept on traveling, secure in the knowledge that sooner or later he'd come to it. So on this great journey into the east, straight meat was the bill of the fare. Ammunition and tools principally made the load on the sled, and the time card was drawn upon the limitless future. To Buck it was a boundless delight, hunting and fishing, indefinite wandering through strange places. For weeks at a time they'd hold on steadily day after day, and for weeks upon end they'd camp here and there, the dogs loafing and the men burning holes through frozen muck and gravel, washing countless pans of dirt by the heat of the fire. Sometimes they went hungry, sometimes they feasted riotously, all according to the abundance of game and fortune of hunting. Summer arrived, and dogs and men packed on their backs, rafted across the Blue Mountain lakes, and descended or ascended unknown rivers in slender boats whipsawed from the standing forest. The months came and went back and forth they twisted through the uncharted vastness, where no men were, and yet where men had been if the lost cabin was true. They went across divides in summer blizzards, shivered under the midnight sun on naked mountains, beneath the timberline in eternal snows, dropped into the summer valleys amidst swarming gnats and flies, and in the shadows of glaciers picked strawberries and flowers as ripe and fair as any southland could boast. In the fall of the year they penetrated weird lake country, sad and silent, where wildfowl had been, but where there was no life nor sign of life, only the blowing of chill winds, the forming of ice in sheltered places, and a melancholy rippling of waves on lonely beaches. And though another winter they wandered on obliterated trails of men who had gone before. Once they came upon a path blazed through the forest, an ancient path, and the lost cabin seemed very near. But the path began nowhere and ended nowhere, and it remained a mystery, as the man who made it and the reason he made it remained a mystery. Another time they chanced upon a time-graven wreckage of a hunting lodge. Amidst shreds of rotten blankets, John Thornton found a long-barreled flintlock. He knew it for a Hudson Bay company gun of young days in the Northwest, when such a gun was worth its weight in beaver skins packed flat. And that was all. No hint as to the man who in an earlier day had reared the lodge and left the gun among the blankets. Spring came on once more, and at the end of their wandering they found not the lost cabin, but a shallow place in a broad valley where the gold shined like yellow butter across the bottom of the washpan. They sought no further. Each day they worked, earned $1,000 in clean dust and nuggets, and they worked every day. The gold was sacked in moose-hide bags, 50 pounds to a bag, piled like firewood outside the Springbow Lodge. Like giants they toiled, days flashing on the heels of days like dreams as they heaped treasure up. There was nothing for the dogs to do except the hauling of meat in now and then when John Thornton killed, and Buck spent hours musing by the fire. The vision of the short-legged hairy man came to him more frequently. Now that there was little work to be done, blinked by the fire, Buck wandered with him in that other world which he remembered. The salient thing of the other world seemed fear. When he watched the hairy man sleeping by the fire, head between knees and hands clasped above, Buck saw that he slept restlessly, with many starts and awakenings, which time he would peer fearfully into the darkness and fling more wood on the fire. Did they walk by the beach of a sea, where the hairy man gathered shellfish, ate them as he gathered? It was with the eyes that roved everywhere for hidden dangers, and with legs prepared to run like wind at its first appearance. Through the forest they crept noiselessly, Buck at the hairy man's heels, and they were alert and vigilant, the pair of them, ears twitching and moving, and nostrils quivering. for the man heard smelled as keenly as Buck. The hairy man could spring up from the trees and travel ahead as fast as the ground, swinging by arms from limb to limb, sometimes a dozen feet apart, letting go and catching, never falling, never missing his grip. In fact, he seemed as much at home on the trees as ground, and Buck had memories of nights of vigil spent beneath trees where the hairy man roasted, holding on tightly as he slept. Closely akin to the visions of a hairy man was a call still sounding in the depths of the forest. It filled him with a great unrest and strange desires, caused him to feel a vague, sweet gladness, and he was aware of wild yearnings and stirrings for he knew what not. Sometimes he pursued the call into the forest, looking for it, as if it were a tangible thing, barking softly or defiantly as the mood might dictate. He would thrust his nose through the cool wood moss or onto the black soil where long grass grew, and snort with joy at the fat earth smells. He would crouch for hours as if concealment behind fungus-covered trunks of fallen trees, wide-eyed and wide-eared to the movement and sound about him. It might be lying thus that he hoped to surprise a call he couldn't understand, but he didn't know why he did these various things. He was impelled to do them and did not reason about them at all. Irresistible impulses seized him. He'd be lying in camp, dozing lazily in the heat of the day, when suddenly he would lift his head and his ears would cock up, intent and listening, and he'd spring to his feet and dash away, on and on for hours through the forest aisles, across the open spaces where the Niger heads bunched. He loved to run down the dry watercourse and to creep and spy upon the bird life in the woods. For a day at a time he'd lie in the underbrush where he could watch partridges drumming and strutting up and down, but especially loved to run in the dim twilight of the summer midnights, listening to subdued and sleepy murmurs in the forest, reading signs and sounds as the man may read a book, seeking for the mysterious something that called, waking or sleeping at all times, for him to come. One night he sprang from his sleep with a start, eager-eyed, nostrils quivering, scenting, his mane bristling in recurrent waves. From the forest came the call, or a note of it, for the call was many-noted, distinct and definite as never before, a long-drawn howl, like, yet unlike any noise made by a husky dog, and he knew it in an old familiar way as a sound heard before. He sprang through the sleeping camp and in swift silence dashed toward the woods. As he drew closer to the cry, he went more slowly, with caution in every movement, till he came to an open place among the trees, and looked out, saw, erect on haunches, with nose pointed to the sky, a long, lean timber wolf. It made no noise, yet it ceased from its howling and tried to sense his presence. Buck stopped into the open, half crouching, body gathered compactly, tail stiff and straight, feet falling with unwonted care. Every movement advertised commingled, threatened with an overture of friendliness. It was a menacing truce that marks the meeting of wild beasts that prey. But the wolf fled at the sight of him, and he followed with wild leaping, in a frenzied overtake. He ran him into a blind channel in the bed of the creek, where a timber jam barred the way. The wolf whirled about, pivoting on his hind legs after the fashion of Joe, and all cornered huskies, snarling and bristling, clipping his teeth together in a continuous and rapid succession of snaps. Buck didn't attack, but circled about and hedged him in with friendly advances. The wolf was suspicious and afraid, for Buck made 3 of him in weight, while his head barely reached Buck's shoulder. Watching his chance, he darted away, and the chase resumed. Time and again he was cornered, and the thing repeated, though he was in poor condition, or Buck couldn't have easily overtaken him. He would run till Buck's head was even with his flank, then he would whirl around and dash away at the first opportunity. But in Buck's end, pertinacity was rewarded, for the wolf, finding no harm was intended, finally stifled noses with him. Then they became friendly and played in the nervous, half-coy way with which fierce beasts belay their fierceness. After some time of this, Wolf started off in an easy lope in a manner that plainly showed he was going somewhere. It made it clear to Buck that he could come, and they ran side by side through the somber twilight, straight up the creek bed, into the gorge from which it was issued, across the bleak divide where it took its rise. On the opposite slope of the watershed they came down to a level country, where great stretches of forest and many streams through these great stretches ran steadily, hour after hour, the sun rising higher and the day growing warmer. Buck was wildly glad. He knew at last he was answering the call, running by the side of his wood brother toward the place where the call surely came. Old memories were coming upon him fast, and he was stirring to them as old as he stirred to the realities of which were the shadows. He had done this thing before, somewhere in the other dimly remembered world, and doing it again, now running free in the open, the unpacked earth underfoot, the wide sky overhead. They stopped by a running stream to drink, and stopping, Buck remembered John Thornton. He sat down. The wolf started on him toward the place where the call surely came, then returned to him, stifling noises and making actions as though to encourage him. But Buck turned about and started slowly on his back track. For the better part of an hour the wild brother ran by his side, whining softly. Then he sat down, pointed his nose upward, and howled. It was a mournful howl, and as Buck held steadily on his way, heard it grow faint and fainter until it was lost in the distance. John Thornton was eating dinner when Buck dashed to the camp and sprang upon him in a frenzy of affection, overturning him, scrambling upon him, licking his face and biting his hand, playing the general tomfool, as John Thornton characterized it. The while shook Buck back and forth, cursed him lovingly. For 2 days and nights Buck never left camp, never let Thornton out of his sight. He followed him about his work, watched him while he ate, saw to him in his blankets at night and out in the morning. But after 2 days, that call in the forest began to sound more imperiously than ever. Buck's restlessness came back on him, and he was haunted by the recollections of his wild brother and the smiling lamb lying on the divide, and they ran side by side through the wide forest stretches. Once again he took to wandering in the woods, but the wild brother came no more, and though he listened through long vigils, the mournful howl was never raised.